So, good afternoon, everyone. I think you can all hear me clearly. I hope you can hear me online. For those of you who don't know, I'm Reverend Judith. I'm the Assistant Curate here at St Martin's, Epsom. So I'd like to give everyone a very warm welcome and thank Christina for coming to give this talk. So hopefully there will be some people watching us live on YouTube and also watching us at a later date. This is our 4th annual Brathwaite Lecture. And today is a very special day, actually, because today, the 21st of September, it was 225 years ago on this very day that John Brathwaite died. John Brathwaite was the owner of 4 plantations in Barbados, growing sugarcane using enslaved labour. And he died in this town of Epsom on this day. And on the 30th of September 1800, he was buried in a vault beneath our feet here in this church. The stone that marks the approximate location of his grave is on the south side of the church, by the first row of pews. His memorial, which was commissioned by his 3 nieces, is over here on the north side of the church. It was moved from its original position in the medieval church when the Georgian church was built 200 years ago, and we've just been celebrating that anniversary last weekend. And the memorial was moved again when this, the 20th century extension, was built. The location for our new memorial, which will commemorate those who were enslaved on Barbados, especially those on the plantations that John Brathwaite owned, is in the area of the pillars of the arch on the south side of the church at the crossing. And looking through that arch from the other side, looking towards this way, you can see the Brathwaite Memorial very clearly. And it will give a new perspective and space for reflection. So I'm now delighted to introduce to you Christina Peake, an artist of Bajan heritage, whose art is frequently inspired by her engagement with interested parties through creative workshops. She's going to tell us about that, and she's also going to share reflections of a recent trip to Barbados. So, thank you very much, Christina.
Everyone can hear me clearly now? Okay, God, I feel quite omnipresent now. Okay, so, thank you so much, Judith, for the introduction. So I think laying out the kind of what I've come to understand, what this Memorial Commission is supposed to intend to reflect upon and remember. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about a little bit of myself, so you know a little bit about me. Some of the perspectives that we've been kind of considering and working through, so Judith and I have been talking a fair amount and meeting up, and I think there's so many different perspectives and sensitivities, especially when you have such contentious histories, and then the way those may have been lived, not just, for example, in Barbados in this context, but obviously then when we think of the descendant kind of communities, and then, waves of migration, how that's been lived in the UK as well, because I think for this commission, which is actually bringing me back quite a lot of reflection in terms of how I've grown up, it's also about, a huge part of this is also about faith and how that's been lived historically in country setting, that kind of thing. So, yes, I'll start off, and then I'll talk a little bit about the project and how we're going to go forward. Okay, so next slide, please, if that's okay. So, as I've been introduced, my name is Christina Peake. So I've been working as an artist quite a long time now, but I've also worked as an educator, facilitator, consultant and advisor, and I work generally with museum and gallery collections currently. So I am a PhD researcher as well with the University of Westminster and the National Archives. So I like to think that my PhD research feeds in a bit to this current commission. So for my PhD research, what I'm doing, I like to think of it in two parts. So the National Archives, I'm using the National Archives to kind of map and understand not just the colonial histories within the Caribbean, specifically looking at Barbados as a primary field site, because that's where my family's from, but also looking at this to expand it. So it's not just, say, for example, how we see early colonisation within the Caribbean, how we see enslavement and the transatlantic trade coming into effect and it essentially being an industrialised practice, or when we have abolition. It's not just kind of these, in terms of histories of colonialism, but these histories where it expands into the ecological, into the environmental. How has that affected environments? And for me, my primary interest is the marine environment. Okay? So currently, many islands in the Caribbean, actually the kind of Caribbean region, have the most degraded marine environments in the world now. Not just because of things like climate change, but historically things like, for example, because of construction, development, these kind of the sediment and different things goes into the marine environment and kind of kills corals, which affects biodiversity. You have things like pesticides, runoff. You have obviously the historical kind of changing of those environments through creation of plantations. All these different kinds of things impact these environments. So it's looking at the longer term history of that. And then the other side of it, the other part, is me working as an artist to see how can I create or contribute to, probably is a better word, the kind of an intervention in terms of in the marine environment that supports communities, that engages ecologically, that engages culturally. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at. So recently, been in Barbados this summer doing field work there, but taking time out a little bit to also touch on this. So that's a little bit about me. As I said, I am British and I'm also Barbadian. I'm a citizen of both countries and I have been travelling between the UK and Barbados all my life. First time I went to Barbados, I was 6 months old. So to me, I consider it my home. And it's, again, one of the reasons I do PhD research, specifically in that environment when I had the opportunity, because it's trying for me to contribute and give back to another place that I consider one of my dual homes. So, next slide, please. So, I think one of the things I wanted to touch on here is that, as we've kind of been introduced in terms of Brathwaite being interred here and being a slave owner, and looking, and obviously this touching and reflecting on enslaved peoples, their histories, and specifically looking at Barbados and those communities, descendant communities coming from there. Now, I think, for me, I think one of the reflections that's come up, and I think it was quite, it was quite provocative and quite prevalent, I think, when I was in Barbados this year. Because I think, depending on where we sit, we have different perspective of what histories look like. And I know that can seem like quite obvious. But for example, within the UK, if you think of like our national education system, our national curriculum, when I was growing up, there was no representation in terms of any kind of African or history in that kind of way. Definitely nothing about a period of enslavement or anything like that. But now we see in the national curriculum, these things are being touched on, and our education system is becoming quite diverse in terms of the histories that we're teaching, the young population in Britain. However, when we look at something like the history of enslavement, particularly when we're looking at the transatlantic trade, many times within the British national kind of narrative, we have our key kind of people, for example, like Wilberforce, for example. Many times it's positioned in this kind of way that you have these kind of leading kind of figures, and in many ways, the way in which Britain positioned itself was that it was from the first to end, the practice, or to start to, well, from 1804, you start having these people starting to come through regularly, where they're starting to kind of gradually kind of working to then kind of stop the practice. But we don't have it until, like, say, the early kind of like 1830s, when we're having this kind of legislation come through. And Britain positions itself very much as being progressive, as being the country that's, put an end to this trade. It also is actively then trying to provide intervention in the continuance of the trade of enslavement. However, very much Britain does position itself in that context as being the one that's the interventionist, the one that's that we have these key kind of figures. And I think even now in recent years, we've now, more and more, say for example, enslaved people that were key to the abolitionist movement have come forward and come through. People like Kriana, for example. So more and more they're getting that kind of visibility. Let's say probably, I'd say in the last 10 to 20 years, you're seeing more of that. So you have a more rounded, diverse, inclusive representation of how abolitionist movements worked, how they worked internationally, for example, and actually, and also how they changed, whether you're in the UK, whether you're in the Caribbean, or whether you're in the US at the time. However, I think with that, there are parts of those histories that it's almost like many times it's read that when you have the abolition, and you have this kind of emancipation period, that everything kind of stops at that point and everything gets better. It's this kind of mark, and I think there has to be a kind of transparency sometimes that works within the British interest to kind of position it in that way. However, I think when I'm in Barbados, that story tells very differently in terms of people's histories and their lived history. And I can understand how, in the UK, how we see these things, because I think, again, in terms of that perspective, Britain was the leading, dominant imperial power, the largest empire that everyone's ever seen, administrating that, across multiple continents and everything. So you can see how that kind of plays out. I mean, when we look at somewhere, for example, like the exhibition in 1851, the Great Exhibition, where you had kind of, Crystal Palace, and you have this incredible kind of, that becomes the archetype for other countries doing like the World's Fair and different things. So we have the exhibition kind of all nations in 1851 of the Crystal Palace. This is the point actually after you've had the abolition of enslavement, after you've had the apprenticeship period, where essentially now you no longer have that. But actually, what isn't so well known is that actually the East India Company at this point is so powerful and it's given so much kind of license that actually it's exempt from that trade. So within India, actually, the practice of enslavement is still continuing, and it's actually much later that actually the legislation passes where it's then put out renting. So it's the way in which these things are actually practiced and positioned are very different from how it's lived. Again, another point could be, for example, that although the trade of enslavement is stopped, goods are actually brought in. So Britain isn't doing it, but bringing goods for cotton, for example, 60% of like America's cotton at that time in the mid-19th century is all coming from plantations where we see the practice of enslavement is still being used. So actually, a lot of the goods services, and it's amazing when you look into these histories and you see the different, workers' movements and protests and different things that were happening across the UK, actually still in support of the abolitionist movement, and they're keen in different countries and how they put that forward. So, next slide, please. That was Wilberforce there. So if I go into a kind of Bayesian perspective, and I think one that's being really kind of positioned today, and I think it, especially by, I was quite fortunate, in fact, because I heard the Prime Minister speak quite a few times, Mia Motley, there, and, when did we go? I think it was like the 23rd of July. And during this time, we had Emancipation Day. So on Emancipation Day, we had, it was the 1st of August, I would say, and so in particular, it was commemorating the 1937 kind of rebellion surrounding workers' rights, labour kind of activist at the time, Clements. And I think one of the things that I think really kind of stuck with me when they were talking about Clement's pain and what he was saying to people was the histories that we have from post-abolition. So, for example, we have the abolition, 1833. You then have it when you then come into like the 1840s, let's say, apprenticeship period's over. That's happened, right? It's supposed to have gone into this point where this idea of like emancipation has come forward. And it's not just that, the people that enslaved, there's many kind of camps where they also want, not that obviously they want that because they're enslaved, but in the sense that this idea of emancipation, this idea of freedom, and this idea of the dreams that are put forward in terms of the abolitionist movement, and this idea of what equality and equity could look like. However, what you end up happening is that really, obviously, with the apprenticeship period, what we end up finding, and obviously the compensation, which I think was only paid in 2015 to those to people that were enslaving people. So you can imagine how big that payout actually was. I think it's the largest payout that Britain's ever made. Now with COVID, I'm not quite sure in terms of when we had, when we were supporting people, but it's the largest payout that's ever had. But obviously that didn't go to anyone that was actually enslaved. So what you have is the practice essentially ending of enslavement. But really, what does that mean? The social structures don't change. The economic structures don't change. You have no rights afforded to you. You still have to go back to the plantations where you were working. You still have to, for example, you see that the social structures with which you're in, this, highly kind of draconian kind of racial structure is obviously still very much in place. And that title, whether it's classified and no longer present legally as of one point in date, doesn't mean that the way in which a structure has been in place and a way of living and a practice have been in place for hundreds of years suddenly just dissipates. So what you actually have from that time, from the mid, let's say, 19th century up until kind of the 1930s, is that not much changes, really. They're still in the same kind of place. I mean, unless you're someone, for example, it's interesting when you look at like fishing, for example, if you're a fisherman or if you're able to fish, then there's some act of autonomy there, because obviously you are not beholden to going back to the plantation to earn a living and survive for yourself, because you can go and you can fish, and therefore you have a way of earning a living from the sea that can provide for you. But many of those, depending on which parishes you're in, whether you are able to access things like, I don't know, whether it's boats, whether you're able to kind of do that, whether you're able to kind of facilitate that in terms of commerce for yourself, there's many things where, and the structures of what you've known. And I think also when we think of the plantation and the intergenerational kind of representations in terms of families, in terms of structure, in terms of communities, how that would change according to the plantation to plantation. Culturally, you may have legislation and things and the way in which that they're run, but obviously that's very specific to the person that would own those plantations and the way in which they culturally would run those, So I think that, we actually were sitting with my grandfather, he's 90, so he was born in 1935. And, for the first time, we sat down and I was like, Granddad, I'd love to kind of write down, listen and record your stories, because, he's a very stoic kind of person. But he doesn't really, a lot of those memories doesn't really, they're quiet and they're kept to self. They're not always good memories, but, it's kind of hard life. And for some reason, I went away, I didn't think he was very interested, and I came back, a couple of days later, and he'd written out all these notes and all these pages of all the things he wanted to say. I was like, right, okay. Just got the recorder out and started, recording. And he actually started his story saying that. He was like, Christina, I was born not long after slavery, because he said nothing had changed. This idea that, he was like, life, so this is by, he's born in 1935, so in the 1930s, he's like, life is so hard. You do not, he said, when people talk about, you have these stories, whether it's people in Africa or people in poverty having to go and walk for miles for water. He said, I had to do that as a child. I had to go chop wood. There is no recreation time because, my mother's in the plantation, she's in the field, she's working there, or family members are. Or you're in school or you're in church. There is no idea that life was so grinding and hard. And, when you look at places, when you look at the records in terms of the National Archives, and also there's been many kind of West Indian and Caribbean writers who have written a lot of the subject of the Caribbean. And it is, documented that essentially the Caribbean is consciously underdeveloped. So the time you're having, you're around the 1930s when you have the rebellion kind of invoked by Thomas Paine, especially when he's then deported in July 1937. You have mass unemployment, you have a lack of education, you have lack of sanitation, you have all these basically, incredible kind of poverty. And this is when you have like the Moyne Report, for example. So Britain at this point actually, internationally, is starting to be heavily criticised because of its subjects within the Caribbean, because how can these subjects in the Caribbean be, in such kind of grinding poverty and in such poor conditions when you're supposed to be the most powerful nation, leading nation in the world? So actually, like the US is criticising Britain, lots of people are coming under this. But, you're coming after and going into, from First World War to Second World War, you've got all these different kind of factors that are coming into that. But there is this kind of grinding poverty, starvation, incredibly, low pay, if there's even such a thing. There's no kind of union, there's no workers' rights. Essentially, you're living still within, this kind of enslaved feudal system. So when you have 1937 come along and you have these kind of Clements Payne is going around telling people like, no, you know, you don't have to live for this, you need to fight for your rights, you need to protest, all these kind of things. So I think one of the reasons I'm saying this is that from their perspective, and Mia Motley was talking about this story, and obviously, you know, there was different kind of cultural events commemorating it. So she was talking about, you know, by 1937, you know, we're standing up and we're still trying to fight for the rights that we should have had 100 years before. You know, going from that point onwards, you know, you go into the 1950s and 1960s, you're having, you know, 1960s is the first time that, you know, the vote is reduced to 18 and the majority of people actually get to vote in Barbados. And it's, you know, it's such a short history. You know, I think that's one of the things, you know, one of the things I do love talking to people, listen to their histories, but it's such a short history that in the 1960s people actually have the right to vote, because obviously many times things were set up where if you had to have property, you had to have a certain level of income, so many of the population obviously, and 9 times out of 10 that would be Black Barbadians, were excluded from being able to vote. So they had no right in terms of the political, you know, economic powers that were there. So I think one of the things, right, oh, next slide please. So I think, because I've been touching on this, I'm going to go to the next slide. I think looking at these kind of stories of descendants is that I think it's fascinating to hear these histories, but I think as well, and it's something we touched on, you know, at the beginning when I was talking, saying there's this idea of faith, but not the idea of it, the practice of it. You know, growing up, when I'd be in Barbados, that's the only time I went to church, I'll be honest with you. My mum, you know, talked to me, you know, my mum came over here in 79. A lot of my mum and dad's friends came in from the late 1940s over, you know, from Barbados and different countries across the Caribbean, and what we call, a lot of the time people refer to it as Windrush, to the UK. And, you know, so I grew up with people from all over the Caribbean, every kind of patois, everything, just, you know, food, everything. But church was actually, the only time I went to church was in Barbados, so I actually went to Sunday school and everything over there, because, and one of the things that I think was always, it always amazed me when I was in church was this, like, the act of worship and devotion, and literally, like, the Spirit kind of, like, moving people being so engaged by it. I mean, like, some of the stories, I mean, I was just like, I remember once, like, the crucifixion of Christ being, like, kind of using this analogy, this kind of metaphor, and comparing it to, like, coconut bread, and I was like, okay. It's kind of making sense to me. I really don't get it, but it's kind of making sense. It all comes together, the bits come together, and it's, you know, it's beautiful from its parts. But I think, like, and that's something I think that kind of struck me here when I was in Barbados as well this time. It's like, you know, on a Sunday, every single church is full. You can hear people singing coming out the doors, and it's every age that people are in church. And I'm with my family, you know, when we're talking, having discussions, whether it's political, whether it's been going on, like, because of emancipation, there's lots of debates and things going on about Barbados. It's a republic now. Where does it want to take itself? How does it want to take itself forward? You know, and Mia Motley's talking about these things as well about, you know, we've come from a history of being owned and dominated by others. We want a future where we have our own autonomy, where we have our own agency, where we're able to take ourselves forward. But if we're not careful, we're just going to be taken over in a different way by different kind of international powers. Because when you are a developing country, you know, I don't want to say dependence is heavy, but at the same time, you know, something like COVID, many countries obviously not having access to the vaccine and things were dependent on things like the World Health Organization, different things. So it's trying to have your autonomy and that idea of sovereignty, I think, when you're coming from that. So I think in this case, you know, I think thinking of the way in which people remember these histories, remember how it's been, because for them it's a much longer history in terms of where they are today than this idea of this kind of date and time where it stops, where in many ways it's how it's represented in terms of our education system here and the way in which we represent the narrative of enslavement. And so I think this intergenerational kind of, you know, this continuance and storytelling and things is where another reason where I think we, as we're talking a little bit more about what we're going to be doing in the project, where making it as inclusive and having communities such as I can from Barbados, but also wider, because through different people, you know, like in terms of our family, so like African and being heritage societies and things, and sharing about their histories and stuff and their perspectives and what their life is like, then I think these things come into it, especially in the way in which faith has come into it as well. So one of the things I wanted to show with you, because I'm always, work as an artist, I take a lot of photographs of lots of different things. It's also one of the reasons I was in Barbados, because I was documenting the coral reefs, trying to see the levels of degradation, but I'm always kind of documenting landscape and different things, because there's all different kinds of motifs and little things that come up and that kind of, that you keep these little accents in the sketchbook and things. Next slide, please. So one of the things I think is a kind of architectural motif and within the landscape in Barbados is that of the sugar mill. And you see them everywhere. And the sugar mill, many times, you know, the sugar mill is right next to the great house that you've great the houses on the plantation and things. But considering you have an island that is very, very small, that now the majority of it, you know, the main industry is tourism. So the amount of the hotels that you have, the amount of redevelopment you have in that context. You know, there's only a few kind of great houses that are preserved. You know, some of those are accessible to the public, others are still privately owned in terms of reputation. But the sugar mill is something that you see a lot all over the different parishes, and it's something about this architecture that speaks to the past and kind of creative community might take forward. Next slide, please. I think another one here is the Chattel House. So the Chattel House is now, again, a kind of cultural heritage architectural symbol, I would say. They're beautifully coloured, you know, very bright colours. They've got this, a lot of the time, this lovely fretwork and things. But again, they speak back to these kind of histories. It's the historic and it's the contemporary in the same kind of guise, I think, because these were essentially kind of a type of mobile housing. So whether you're talking from period of enslavement and stuff, this or going forward, really, you know, these houses were very kind of simple in construction, could literally be flat packed, put in the back, put in a cart, you know, and the horse could take you whether you had to go to the next plantation or the other place that you moved, because obviously, again, if you don't have land, you don't have rights, so you cannot build on that land. So many times these chattel houses, and they still are today, are held in like, you know, large kind of coral rocks or now breeze blocks, but many times they don't have concrete foundations because you were not allowed to build on the land, because obviously you didn't own it and you had no access to ownership. So there's something that's linked to this history, I think, of come to enslavement and its descendants, but now it's this also kind of cultural icon. And I think it's also, you know, I find them fascinating because they change so much. So you could, you know, you'd have these expansions, these lean-tos and stuff. So you can imagine as a family kind of expands, the chattel house gets, you know, a few more like sides to it, and it comes out a little bit, and then, you know, family leave and they move on, and then they kind of construct themselves. And sometimes, honestly, you see them and it looks like they're like a hair's breadth that someone's just going to blow them down. It just needs a fine breeze. But now they're kind of being maintained and stuff. So the way in which we have the blue plaques here is something that you find some on these chattel houses now in Barbados. They have their own equivalent on kind of heritage plaques and marking these sites. And I think in all things, despite kind of challenge and suffrage, there's always within communities and individuals ways in which they express their autonomy, they express their sovereignty, they express their community, and they express their, you know, their sense of self and their culture and where they are. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to touch on, as I said, you know, I touched on a little bit of my PhD work, is that of nature, which is one of the reasons I was there, and faith. So the way I was brought up with my grandmother is that she, you know, all of the women in my family are Christian. My other half, my uncles were Rastafarian. But especially my grandmother, she had this very environmental, ecological kind of thought process when it came to faith and God. So my grandmother would always say to me, you know, the world and nature is God's house. That is the best place that you're ever going to see God. And it was always, she always used to say to me as well, you know, there's nothing you ever have to fear within nature because that's God's place. It's humans in the way in which they conduct yourself that are actually your biggest threat. Creatures, you know, they live as they are and how they've been created, but this is kind of, you know, this is where devotion can be lived. This is where the presence of God is. This is where, you know, like wonder and joy and just, you know, marvel at the world you're in. That's where that lives. And so for me, you know, but that also linked in with different kind of Caribbean folklore and culture, and, you know, the Caribbean a very syncretic place. Different faiths, whether it's African faith practices, you know, from Yoruba cultures, for example, to when you have indigenous kind of Caribbean as well. And I think when you have, like, say, for example, the Tahina or the Carib or Kalinga, I think there's all these different kind of indigenous populations as well that have been there, and their representation and their relationships that they have to nature and to the sea, which I think, you know, Barbados, you know, that there is a kind of, and there is actually, now I've been learning, because I thought many times this idea that there's this kind of mass exodus and that many aren't able to stay in Barbados past early colonisation, but actually that you do have people that travel back and that there is this community there of Indigenous Caribbean community in Barbados. And so I think that representation is also something that's very key. I think representative and being inclusive of different faiths. But I think the way this is represented, I think, within nature and the way in which I learned it is something, again, in terms of creatively and in terms of motifs, in terms of the visual language. And somewhere like Barbados, because it's, you know, it's just out of the Caribbean ring, but actually it's a coral island. And there's something so incredibly unique about that. Because actually over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, we've got millions, you know, this coral reef has come up, plateau has come up and up and up until it's out of the water. So what you have are these stunning kind of huge kind of coral cave systems, actually, this network of cave systems, and then you have these gullies, what we call gullies, which I always thought, when I was a kid, they were like, you know, they were like where the wild things live, because you just have this crevasse with like rainforest coming out of it, and I'd be like, oh my God, what the hell's in there? And I'd be like, you know, there's all these stories in my head of what could be coming in there. But actually these be like collapsed cave systems. So then they become these microclimates and these kind of natural greenhouses where you have all kinds of like biodiversity living within them. You know, they're incredible in terms of plant species. There are also places where, you know, cave systems as well, because it's being filtered by the coral, you have incredibly pure water. So they were also used by Indigenous as well as marine enslaved people as well for places in terms of like escape routes and things. They were used as places for medicine. So there's all kinds of, I think the natural geography and structure of the island is something that lends itself, I think, again, to this kind of incredible sense of this matrix or this kind of ecosystem that Barbados is as an island. And actually it's just this point coming out just at the tip of the Atlantic, and then on the other side's the Caribbean Sea. So for me, I think, you know, I did say I was there in terms I was mapping the degradation of the coral reefs, which is really quite bad. But I also thought to kind of highlight, I think, some of the most kind of, what I love, some of the most beautiful parts of it. But this is something that I think, when it comes to the work and it comes to this, I think the idea of and understanding your church as well as being quite sustainably minded, kind of, you know, climate aware and ecologically focused is bringing in some of these ideas as well. And I think, again, this reflects to Barbados's current positioning and the communities there. So, you know, again, referring to the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley is, you know, one of the leading voices within the Caribbean and internationally in terms of the conversations on climate change. Barbados is somewhere that, because it's flat and it's low-lying, it's incredibly vulnerable to climate change. You have rising sea levels, you have constant coastal erosion, you have, as I've said, some of the practices where you've got like runoff in terms of like, you know, from nitrogen to pesticides, different things. So there's all these different factors that are affecting it. But again, because it's low-lying, you know, it's in particular vulnerable. And then also they're a leading voice in terms of reparations, because the idea of condensation and how it's affected the island, you know, things like soil quality, all these different kinds of things impact and take a long time for them to be able to recover. So, I mean, I'm just going to touch on some of the corals there, because I do think that even when you find degradation and maybe you find these challenges, there's always these incredible markers of what nature provides and what humanity provides as well. So if you go to the next slide, please, I can pop through these. So these are kind of some of the corals that were in, like, this is a marine, a lot of the time we focus on Marine Park, which is a marine reserve and is protected, but actually is probably one of the most degraded areas in on the whole of the west coast of Barbados, despite it being a marine reserve. You know, intense tourism and, you know, construction and things, and water runoff are going out into somewhere that's a marine protected area. Next slide, please. So these next couple of ones, I mean, I love corals because they're symbiotic. They're symbiotic creatures, I think, many times, because although they're essentially a creature, you know, an animal in terms of the polyp, they use plant enzyme within them to create food and to live, basically. So one of the reasons they bleach is actually when the heat, one of the things is that when those heat temperatures go too high, it kills the plant enzyme, they can no longer feed themselves, and that's when they die. And I think there's something very symbiotic in that idea of people, environment, and faith. That's, that's very key here. So going forward. Sorry, next slide, please. So I can link through these quite quickly. So yes, these are more kind of, in terms of motifs, and they're also like, you know, they live as kind of communities, very closely knit, very close together, and I think it's, again, looking at natural kind of like metaphors and things that are also representative, but are highly linked to cultural identity currently of Barbados. And also, again, this idea of autonomy and things as well, because many times things like fishing and things in terms of people that were enslaved and then, you know, were freed and things, is that, you know, this was one of the key points of, as I said, of autonomy. And I think when there's small ways in which our population is able to do that because they're under such draconian measures, kind of identifying that, acknowledging that, I think is a key kind of way of kind of personal emancipation, really. Next slide, please. Yeah, this was deeper with the, when I was diving with the corals and stuff as well. So next slide, please. So this is just a highlight, so we were doing some beach cleanup. But yeah, this was highlighting some of the climate things that you have in Barbados, like the plastics and things and stuff that, I mean, these aren't from people leaving these Barbados, these are from them coming in across the Atlantic Ocean. Comes to, which you see, I mean, when I've been in Sri Lanka, for example, I've been in different places, like the amount of the kind of islands, like, I mean, they say there's kind of like some of them are like the state size of like countries now that are floating on the oceans and then being dropped is something that's quite a key issue with that. And obviously, you know, microplastics and things in oceans, you know, and how that devastates biodiversity. But also the black there that you can see there is sargassum seaweed. And before, this used to be a normal kind of ecological, obviously, cycle in terms of the ecosystem of seaweed transporting itself. But again, because of things like pesticides and different things, nitrogen and the rising sea temperatures has massively grown, and now is actually becoming like a point of public health concern and things, because when they break down, they smother like the oxygen with the water, kills biodiversity, and also then the gases and things that they let off actually can cause respiratory problems, all these kind of things. So, and you can imagine again in somewhere like Barbados where you're dependent on tourism, the smell, the look, you know, the perception in terms of the beaching country is a big thing. So yeah, we're trying to do our little bit, I mean, yeah. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is, so I know I've been talking a little bit about history and perspectives and reflections from going to Barbados. So how do I actually put these things together? What do I intend to do? So as an artist, what I usually do is I love to talk, and we kind of create and develop a brief. You may start off with an initial brief of what you kind of want, but what does that actually look like? How do you flesh that out and the scope of it? What's the kind of sensitivities and things that you have to really kind of consider? What's the kind of political orientation around it? Separate, I'll put economics to one side, but that's a quiet discussion. But how do you you know, really approach these things? And I think whenever you're talking about histories around enslavement and what that means in current lived experience and things of others, then you have to be really sensitive to that. And a lot of time I think there needs to be consultation with that. So a lot of the time for me, I'll do research into the work that I'm doing into, so for example, one residency I did was in the Peruvian Amazon with indigenous communities there. So I spent a lot of time researching Amazonian cultures, different tribal cultures, depending on different regions, because I was in the Peruvian Amazon, as well as like obviously environmentally what that means for you and different things. So you research what you're going to be doing and, you know, a lot around the place and space that you're going to be working in. But nothing can replace that of doing field work and consultation. So that's that's a preparation, if you like. So then I go to the Peruvian Amazon in this context, or in this one, you know, part of that consultation, I think, was me going to Barbados, or, you know, to see what's the kind of perspectives and see how these things are being situated. And I think a lot of these histories around and reflection around enslavement are very topical and critical at this time because of what's happening politically and how the country is orientating itself. So it was very kind of important to kind of really kind of reflect on that and take that in. The other part of that, as I said, is consultation, especially where community is involved. So with this, what I'd like to do, and reflecting on the, as I said, like material that's taken from Barbados, but also researching around this subject. And what I do is, what we're planning to do is a series of workshops. And what we'd like to do is invite different communities. So for example, someone that may like to approach would be a specific kind of Brathwaite organisation where we could access the community there to see how they feel and reflect on their perspectives and how they are on this kind of subject matter. I think trying to get diverse perspectives and consideration is a key thing, because obviously so many of those can differ according to different people, and I don't want to be essentialist or generalise the way in which people view these histories or how they've lived them or what they may know within their own families and their own ancestral kind of heritage. So another one would be obviously your congregation be likely to do workshops. So when I do workshops, usually what these are is that I will kind of share the research that's come out of it more in detail. I know I've touched on some of the perspectives, but share more in detail kind of like the research, what we're doing in terms of the project, so you have an understanding of that. And I usually link that with creative activities that will link into each other. So they provide or perform a basis to encourage discussion, whether you're put into groups, whether it's in pairs, whether it's coming out in the work itself. They're interlink. Usually a lot of the times this may link with things like listening exercises, sharing, storytelling, and we capture that creatively in the work, because again, the motifs and different things that people come out with when they talk about their stories or their perspective or their views. And I always have to say, I always love a good debate as well. You know, it's always great when you get really challenging perspectives on things, because that's what you want to hear, and from different perspectives as well. I understand like it's a diverse kind of community as well. So I think hearing different perspectives and seeing what that's like is really important. So yeah, we would have the workshops whereby, you know, maybe probably, you know, like half a day workshop, maybe like kind of 3 to 4 hours kind of thing. So we can take our time, have a break and things. So yeah, I invite different groups to different groups where, you know, your local community group, people outside of that, to bring in that kind of voice and how that's heard. And through those different workshops, and which I would say document, depending, I have to consider whether it's something where we might record parts of it, for example, not necessarily visually, but a lot of the time I love audio recording, because audio recording, you know, say if there's particular storytelling parts. So for one project that I did, it was with Imperial College, and we did workshops. For that, actually, you know, there was like storytelling exercises where they were looking at key figures to them in terms of their journey. So how did they end up at Imperial College? How did they ended up taking forward their, you know, what aspect of science that they're studying? So it was this idea that you have these key figures in science, but who are the key figures that surround an individual that lift them to where they are today? Or it could be a place, it could be an event that happened, it could be a particular experience. So they were telling each other these stories. It was a lot about kind of empathy and listening. And when you told the other person their story, the other person had to make a sculpture based on the story that they shared with them. Because it was this idea of that, how do we handle and deal with the stories of others? How do we listen? How do we respect them? Have we actually taken them in fully and actually reflect what they've said? Because the story of one and then how it becomes to another, that idea, you know, of the story changing as it goes hand to hand is something that happens. But obviously when it's the stories of particular cultures that are taken and then represented by others, that can have very real kind of consequences. So I think that's the kind of thing in terms of the workshops where we might record, because also I think audio recording is not as intrusive. When people have a camera on them, I mean, it can be quite a lot, but if you've just got sound recording, you know, there's a kind of anonymity to that, but also it captures like the conversation. And I love like the cadence and the way in which people speak, the language, the vocabulary. It's really quite fascinating to me, but it's a way that I keep almost like a kind of working journal, sketchbook. So I always keep kind of journals of things. And then from what's learned from the workshops, from what's learned from the research, from what's learned from the fieldwork, basically what I then end up bringing out is the kind of different threads that will feed in then to the creation of an artwork. We put up the next slide, please. So, as I said, I'm be tentative in this because I wouldn't be able to tell you now what I'm going to make. I could tell you roughly in the sense that obviously because of the positioning where it will be, most likely it will be, say for example, a 2D work. I probably won't be making like a sculpture. I mean, I've made all different kinds of things over the years for different museums and galleries and organisations, because I tend to make work that reflects the story that's coming out. So I've made huge kind of absolutely massive like pop-up books. I've made, as I said, paintings and sculptures and film and animation and lots of different things. But I think for this, we will have, it will be a two-day work from where it can be hung, and we also got to think of the sustainability and lifespan of the work. I think the building itself, I mean, I love stained glass, and I think the stained glass you have here is absolutely stunning. And my palette in my work a lot of the time, I'm not gonna lie, it's quite colourful. That's the Bayesian in me, the Barbadian in me coming out quite a lot in that Caribbean culture. So I love a lot of colour, but I mean, stained glass is so saturated with colour and light, it's a beautiful thing. So these things, I bring out different commonalities, different stories, different motifs that would come out of the work. And I think when people, as I said, create, all these different things kind of come out other than what's come out to my eye when I've travelled and I've researched. So I think that, I like to think these, I think we're planning 4 different workshops, Judith, aren't we? Yeah, that the different stories that will come out of even those workshops, linking that with the research and the fieldwork that's been done, we will create quite a unique piece of work. But one I like to think, although we're in reflection and remembrance of enslaved peoples in this context, in particular, say for example, Brathwaite plantation, but I think it expands upon different communities, different parishes, and different places in Barbados. But the way in which that's lived, the way in which that story is told by a nation today, I think is where I definitely want to kind of reflect the contemporary kind of relationship and those histories, but also I think faith is a key part of this, and I think the history that be that of an institution and how that may have been lived in places like the Caribbean, places like Barbados. I mean, I've read accounts, for example, from the, is it the 17th century? Where this idea of that, where it's this conversation between someone who's a plantation owner and someone who's kind of travelling through and he's staying with him, and he's talking to this plantation owner saying, you know, this enslaved man saying to him, he wants to know gold, he's so fascinated by it, he wants to be closer, you know, to have this kind of understanding of that, and he's really bright. So he says, you know what, I'm going to go to this plantation owner, I'm going to speak on your behalf, and I'm going to see what he says. So he goes to him, he's like, you know, this person really wants to know God, he really, he's fascinated by, you know, our faith, you know, can we not enable that, can we not teach that, can we not show that? And plantation then goes, no, we can't do that. It's like, if I do that, every other planter in the island is going to, essentially, is going to want my guts for garters. They're like, no, we can't do that, because this idea of being Christian and sovereignty, and that you can't enslave a Christian the same way they can't enslave an Englishman, meant that, you know, he had to go around and goes, I'm sorry, you know, I can't, you know, enable that to happen. Obviously, we know through a lot of work within the church, obviously Christianity is spread, and it's obviously spread to enslaved peoples as well. But I think it's this kind of thing where you have practice of an institution and how that works historically, politically, economically, you have those things. But I also think that from what I've seen, what I've lived and the experience, intentional memories of intergenerational memories within my family, is that the love of faith that they have is so intrinsic to who they are, their well-being, the way in which they see the world, the politics that they have, their ethics, everything. That to me, even if they may be the history of the institution, how has it been lived by people in those communities? What has it given them? What is it strength that has given them? You know, how are they, which they've seen and read the world. So even when you're in the most kind of draconian and incredibly challenging circumstances, you know, despite how some things may be lived, or exclusion, different things in terms of where you may be able to practice and stuff, you know, where you may be able to, you know, practice your faith and things, you know, like my grandmother told me, you know, nature is the greatest church you'll ever know, because the natural world is, you know, is God's creation. So to me, that idea of the natural world and this place where there is no boundaries to a place. But I also think, you know, in terms of what you are as a church, being inclusive, I think that's a lovely, I like to think it's something that's quite strong in terms of a motif. And I think actually when you look at a lot of the stained glass and the use of like kind of natural imagery within it, actually it's always a key kind of visual language within faithless representation. So I'm going to bring this to a close. So I know that's kind of a loose kind of talk and sharing of ideas and perspectives, but as we said, when we have the workshops, then be able to share more and as we progress it. And I think Judith was saying that, you know, sharing as we develop the work at different milestones and things. But I hope that gives a little bit of background. And I hope, most importantly, that I am trying to come to this with as much sensitivity as possible for everyone that's involved, and obviously, you know, as a community, being in this stunning church and, you know, seeing that work every day, and hopefully not hating it, you know, that you'll be okay. So I think it's, you know, I just think it's I am trying to come in it as much as possible, as much kind of consideration of people's different viewpoints and things as possible as well. Is that okay? Yeah.
So thank you, Christina, that was great. I'm just going to give a little bit more information. We're talking about the workshops, the workshops that we've planned. The four workshops. One for some members of the congregation. For this, how this works normally is having about 10 to 15 people in a group, which is a good size to be able to do this. So one group would be the congregation. The second group would be the Brathwaite family group that Peter Brathwaite's involved with. The third group would be a group in Sutton African Caribbean Heritage Association. That's fairly local to us, and that's a good connection. And Christina's mother.
Yes, yeah. I'm hoping to facilitate that. We've got to look at this.
So we have a connection there, and Sutton and Epsom is quite close. And the fourth group would be a wider Barbadian diaspora group, hopefully arranged through the Barbados High Commission. So some of these, they need to be fleshed out and everything, but
yeah, that's what we're hoping.
But that's the plan. And if I say a bit about the proposed timetable, obviously Christina's got other work as well, but we're hoping to have the workshops in February or March next year. Yeah. Then that would give Christina time to collect together an idea and a draft, some information that she can share with the PCC, and also obviously the diocese, the diocesan advisory committee, and fitting in with their timetable with meetings and things like that, so that we can work with them, so that we can move ahead as and when. And ideally, it would be wonderful, and that's what we would like to aim for, is for in July for the work to be completed. So next July, which would be that would be amazing. so let's just see. But anyway, that's to give you some idea about that. And so, are there any questions, John?
Thanks very much. I didn't get everything. I didn't hear everything because I'm a bit deaf. So if you have said something, then you'll have to, and I didn't get it, you'll have to excuse me. But
that's okay.
First of all, just in response to Judith, is it feasible for the Diocesan Advisory Committee to work on a project which is evolving over a period? They can do that.
Well, I think, yes, if we show them what's happening, because we need their approval for what we're doing. So, for example, as Christina was saying, the idea at the moment is something that's hanging down. Well, I mean, first of all, we have liaised with them saying where the position for the memorial, so that seems sensible to them, and it was their suggestion that the memorial should be from somebody of a Barbadian background, and an artistic creation rather than words. So yes, I think so. Yes, obviously we have to meet. We show them what we're doing, and they can, if they say, we don't like that, can you change that? Yes, work with them. I think that's very good.
And then just a more general comment. I'm excited by I'm excited by your thinking in this area, because I thought the memorial was going to be, shall we say, much more focused on slavery as such.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you are telling the story is that we are all part of a mixture of different histories, and we need to become conscious of them. And those different histories are also, and because they are different histories of different groups, are people with whom we need to have some relationship, continuing relationship. Mm-hmm. And the memorial perhaps can facilitate that.
Oh, I forgot I've got this on so you can still hear me, sorry. So I think yes. Lovely eloquent way of speaking, by the way. I think there's a couple of things. So yes, I think when Judith and I first started talking, obviously that was one of the key kind of objectives. But again, I think with different debates and conversations that have been happening over recent years, some of the criticisms, for example, can be that, and I'd say like across black communities, for example, so African, Caribbean, that when you only have the representation of enslavement, that's the fundamental identity of yourself and your community that's put forward, without any other caveat. So many times it can be a very trauma-laden, victim-laden representation and identity that's put forward of a community, who are so much more than that history. And I think, again, to me, opening that out so it isn't necessarily this monolithic trauma, because people did many things. I mean, there's been so many, politically speaking, strategically speaking, you know, throughout enslavement, you have constant kind of organised insurgency, rebellion, constantly. You know, in 1675, you have, you know, the rebellion where they tried to make, where you've got King Kufi, who was from Nigeria, I think he was a Khan, and they were going to overthrow the kind of plantocracy and install this person as king. And then you have, not long after Brathwaite passes in 1800, and then you have the Busters Rebellion, or General Busters. Now, that was the picture of the lovely man with the broken chains, who's like commemorated in Barbados, and where you do the Emancipation Walk and you go up to his statue. So I think it's not just, you know, it's highly organised kind of constant resistance, constant rebellion, and that's not just in the Caribbean, that's in lots of different places, but I think it's also this idea of the different ways in which, say, something like faith has an autonomy, has people's identity, how they live and they work through that kind of thing. You know, I think, you know, when we think of the abolition movement, when you have like, you know, like the Wedgwood kind of thing, am I not a man and a slave, you know, when he's on his knees, and, you know, the abolition kind of representations and stuff. But this is a key, you know, today, and it has been for some years, this is a key criticism coming from those communities. And it's not just like, say, for example, African and Caribbean communities. I think it's coming from lots of different communities, depending on the way in which they're depicted and represented. So especially when you have a very trauma-laden, very contentious, you know, horrific part in terms of, you know, that diaspora, let's say, history in some ways, because obviously coming from the Caribbean, you've got a huge diaspora covering from the US to across Europe, lots of different places, right? That it's, you know, so I think that's the thing I'm very aware of. That's why the kind of listening and the reflection and the consultation of what people in those communities living today feel. They live, and intergeneral memory, I think, is a key one, because if you think this work ideally will be there for some time, right? Perspectives and conversations are always going to change. They're always going to evolve. So in some ways, try and have this reflection of this idea of how this lives through generations. And so there's that evolution of how people think of themselves, how countries depict themselves, how their positionality changes, all those kinds of things. So I do think it's that kind of commemoration, but today and for some time, you have to be considerate of that's not the way that people want to solely be identified. And I think that's why with things like this, consultation is so critical to understand what that means. I mean, obviously, I can't canvass the entire of the UK population, but taking the time to do that. And so, for example, with the African Caribbean Heritage Society, that I initially introduced my mum to, that she's a part of, the reason I thought they were quite good is that they are actually coming from, I mean, I think the eldest is like 85. I mean, the grandkids come in sometimes and stuff as well, but I'd say they're an age between like 50, 30 to 85. And I think many times as well, what we're talking about is people that have lived in their country of origin, and then they've migrated to the UK. So they have a memory of two different countries. I mean, I would say I'm quite unique in the fact that I've lived between two countries all my life. Generally, when people migrated here from the Caribbean, obviously due to money, due to economics, all these kind of things, they weren't able to constantly go back. You know, that's even if you could have your children over. If many people left their children in the Caribbean, came here to work with the idea for them to be brought over, it didn't always happen, so they maybe stay with family. So there's all kinds of factors there, but I think, you know, you're also talking about people, you know, with my mum, she was born before Barbados had independence, so it was still considered a British colony when my mum was born. We see it was a British colony when my grandfather was born. So I think encapsulating these narratives of people going back in terms of their memory, which I also think is something that's, you know, incredibly important, you know, then I think that's a key thing. Obviously you want to have, and where they, if they arrange to attend, you can have the younger narratives, but I think there's something when people have, over their lifespan, can talk and have memory of literally from being a colonial state, colonial country, to being independent, to them being a republic, is actually a swathe of history that's a very critical memory. And then, so just things like this, where this one of the first things I think we kind of, Judith and I talked about and opened up. It's like, how do people want to be depicted? Because I'd say that's been both sides of the Atlantic. You know, the people, you know, and again, it's a master, you know, I'm talking generally, so we're not please everyone, but, you know, Barbados doesn't necessarily, it's very aware of its history, and it's, you know, it's incredibly culturally creative, amazing place, but no place wants to be completely kind of defined by some of the most horrific history and lived experience of their people. Even if it is in reflection and commemoration, you want to have a polyvocality. You want to have a much, you know, you want to have something that's as living and as, you know, diverse as you are. Does that make sense? I hope that answers the question.
Are there any other questions? Oh, hang on. Thank you for what you've said this afternoon. I'm just wondering how, the approach that you've taken to the people and the experiences and so on, chimes or doesn't chime with the experience of our young people in school and what they're being taught there. And sort of thinking about perhaps those sort of older secondary age pupils, whether there might be some way of including them in our community.
Okay, so actually going back a little bit now, it's been a while, I actually worked for an organisation called the Black Curriculum, which was specifically there, so I would train like staff, like teachers and things, as well as working with young people and actually contribute to designing curriculums and things and reviewing curriculum to try and have a much more diverse and complex representation and understanding in terms of, say, for example, particularly in that case, it was like Black history. But obviously, if you set a precedent, it doesn't stop in that case, because we see the representation, I don't know, whether you're talking about East Asian, South Asian, whether you're talking about Latina culture, whatever it is, you know, once you start with one place and you set a precedent, then you can have a much more kind of inclusive and representative kind of curriculum for others. I think many times it depends on the school and what their ethos and policy is. As individuals, you know, as in like families or in communities, and they wanted to take part or share in that, I think that's definitely something that potentially, although I have to check with Judith, could be supported. But I think it's, I mean, I know they may be, I think, it depends on in the way in which the national curriculum is interpreted by the schools, because obviously they have to, obviously, teach what they're supposed to teach. Obviously, that's a national mandate in that kind of context. But I think in terms of I think there's a number of things. In terms of like signposting, they can easily do that in terms of different resources and different things if you think they might be interested in terms of communities. But yeah, there's also different ways maybe that we could talk about how that.
We did consider that we had quite a wide, lots of different people at the very beginning when we were considering these workshops, and school children, they were part of it, and especially because we have a church school. But we narrowed it down for the time scale that we have, the period now, because once the memorial's there, although it won't be the same as people, their workshops working into the memorial, I mean, they can, things can happen. There are other ways of doing it with people afterwards, and hopefully the fact that when we have the memorial, the children will be interested in what they do with the national curriculum at the moment. It fits in with it. It's just.
Could be this stage of outreach to different things that you do.
Yes, I think that's where you have the memorial, and we're making connections with people that we want to continue. We don't want a lot of criticisms of anything that sort of involves different communities is that once the actual project's finished and done, that all connections lost. So that's one thing. We don't know what's going to happen, but that to go forward and to continue.
I mean, I do think, well, I like to think anyway, with these kind of, the way in which we kind of approach projects, it means that you accumulate a lot of material, a lot of stories and different things. So obviously, as this project, for your church, that means that ideally you have quite a lot of content that when it comes to future outreach that you may want to do within your community, things, that you actually have a lot of content actually to inform and take forward that could be, really interesting. So, yeah. When
you were talking about the audio sounds, I mean, we could have the exhibit with clips and things in the church at different times, whenever however, there's so much potential with that. So.
Yeah, that's the idea. I like to kind of think when you complete projects like, what, the person that the people that I'm working with, it's like, what can they do to the next part of it? Because if you do that consultation, you reach out to different groups, then I like to think it's like, well, you've reached out to these different groups and now you've got all these different people that beyond me being here, you can now do all these different things. So I like to think, you kind of span the family and meet from people in the community and just like it opens it up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Howard.
I think it goes without saying that it's important to remember history and what has happened in the past, and that it should be truly represented.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that what you said, I particularly picked up on about definitions. You could say Barbados doesn't go around all the time saying we are a nation of people whose ancestors were slaves. That's not who we are. Well, it is who you are, but on the other hand, who you are is what you are now. And what you are currently achieving, and possibly what you have achieved from the past. And you were absolutely right about the time it takes for change to happen. We all expect things to happen more or less immediately, but it doesn't. And it's interesting too, because I live slightly between two countries in a very different way from you, because I have a white American wife, and 3 of our children now live over there. And on our very first visit, we were taken to see a piece of Southern American history.
Yeah.
A plantation.
Yeah.
A magnificent house, magnificently furnished with great artworks and lovely gardens.
Yeah.
The gardens over there are maintained not by the National Trust, but by prisoners doing work outside the prison.
Oh, okay.
And so all around this plantation that we were being shown with such pride were groups of men chained by their ankles, hoeing and pruning and so on and so on, while white prison guards with rifles were sort of lounging around watching them at it. And nobody saw the irony in this.
Wow. Wow.
And then, of course, that's related to your picture of the Chattel house, you see, which now looks so clean.
Yes.
And so wonderful. And it really wasn't like that at all. So there is this tension between remembering exactly how it was.
Yeah.
But perhaps more important than slavery as a fact is why there was slavery. The greed and lack of respect for other people that people have. And that's the underlying Christian message. So because of all that bit about the changing history, the need to emphasize the present, I'm going to be very interested in what you have to. Thank you very much for your efforts on this project.
Well, no, I thank you for that reflection, because, wow, that was quite sounds like a Tarantino movie. I think that is a scene from a Tarantino movie, isn't it? I'm not quite sure. But I think you're absolutely right. But that vision that you just created, I think that, that is it though, isn't it? Like the past can literally be sitting right there and no one sees it, but you're standing there and you're like, whoa, does no one else see this? Does no one see what's happening here? So not freaking anyone else out, because I feel like I'm in like multiple universes, multiple timelines and things. But I think it is that, and it's, I think that was a great point that you made about the Chattel House. It's like the same with the sugar mills. All you see now is this, brick structure, because they're so thick and it's the last of it. You know what I mean? It's this this kind of last echo into the past of this like literal kind of physical marker. But then obviously you can't imagine what it was like, in the kind of substance there. So I think you're absolutely right. And I be absolutely, honest and transparent that I think it's a difficult tension. I think it's a very difficult tension to meet, I think it's difficult, I'll be honest, I think, not necessarily even just speaking as an artist, but I think it's difficult for anyone when they are trying to engage these kind of things. And, I'm very aware of my background and heritage, and I think it's very difficult to, when you even just kind of take those things on, and it's like, well, and it's kind of doing justice to the past and then the present, and there's always going to be a continuance to the present, and then the present is always going to be at some point the past. So it's this, I think it's also this idea of kind of evolution of time and place and people and what that means, which is another aspect of it. I mean, there's only so much you can put into an image. But again, I think, and I say it again, it's like the stained glass that you have. I mean, one of the things I think is like when the visual language that you have so much within the the natural metaphors, the way in which, the iconography where you have, the way in which like different people are represented, the way in which like Christ is represented, all these different kinds of things, all this kind of language, that it's so kind of complex and layered. And actually I've always found it incredible. I mean, I've always liked churches because I think well, I've always found them kind of places like for reflection, but the way in which so many things are represented and the visual language that you have in it, and I think when you have that, it's, there's a lot of the time maybe I might even do some kind of recipes to go with it, Judith, just to explain all the kind of things and what they end up meaning to me, because it gets quite complex, it gets quite layered. But how else do you tell a story? You can have a novel and doing 400 pages, and I've got one image to try and say all these things that I'm hearing and seeing in people's thoughts, and you want to reflect everyone and do everyone the kind of do that justice, and so it's a hard ask. But ultimately in my mind, I think to myself, can this be an artwork where anyone came through that door, irrespective of where they came from, and they would see a kind of, or like to see, kind of embodiment of history and narrative, an idea or different ideas of emancipation, but also faith and autonomy. What is it I want to see when someone comes through that door? And that you can see me and I can see you. Do you know what I mean? And that the bottom line is that whatever those histories and things that are a part of that subject show, that you and I can sit in the same church and, and listen to the same sermon and practice the same faith and walk out together, go to the pub opposite, and have a drink. Well, they say in Barbados you keep the spirits together. They went to the rum shop, they went to church, but they were right next to each other.
I'm interested how the workshops work and how they function. Is it the case that you try to reach a consensus within the workshop and allow that consensus to feed into your artistic inspiration? And if so, what happens if you really can't achieve consensus? Because, believe me, within this congregation, there's quite a divergence of views.
Yeah, so I'm not even trying to reach a consensus. I don't think it's possible. I think in the best world in the world, and a lot of the time, the subjects I'm dealing with, or communities or environments, they usually are quite heavy. So the best will in the world, I'm not looking for a consensus, because I think, again, having multiple voices, if they conflict, if there's tension, if there's contention, that's fine. I like to think, so one of the things I would say when I do workshops and things that I facilitate, because I'll design it, I'll lead it, you know, I mean, you should be there for me, but I do have rules of engagement, for want of a better term. The way in which, you know, because I think you have to. I think with anything like, especially when it's contentious and sensitive, and also, you know, in safeguarding and protecting people. Because actually when you have, as best as possible, I try and create a safe space, because when you're, and I know that seems like quite a loaded term because it's said a lot, but when you're taking 10 to 15, 20 people, you're putting them in a room, and essentially what you're trying to do is, in the short term, create a community. You're trying to build very quickly a feeling of trust, a feeling of safety. So then when you are asking questions, or encouraging debate, or storytelling, or creation of work that actually requires, should they be comfortable to do so, sharing quite a lot of themselves, you have no idea what someone's going to come out with. You have no idea what's going to kind of provoke someone to say something, or their, you know, their point of view. You know, so in that case, as much as possible, I try to create a setting where the rules of engagement are very clear in terms of respect, in terms of trust, whether anonymity needs to be a factor, or the way we may make things anonymous, again, confidentiality, considering, you know, the nature of what we may do in terms of the workshops, so people feel that they are able to share what they may wish to share, and obviously no one's pressured in any way, but setting those terms sometimes is really key. And that what I would do with, say, for example, with that content, how that content would be stored, because again, if people are sharing personal details about their life, you need to know that who has access to that, what happens with that content, or, you know, in most cases whether it be got rid of. So I'm very clear in terms of rules of engagement for that. Now, going back in terms of like not reaching consensus, I have this lovely idea that I love a good debate and conversation, and that it's okay to disagree with one another, and that no one's going to take it and be rude and disrespectful, and, you know. So to me, I think many times when I've done workshops, you do have a lot of debate, and people clash, and they don't get on, and they don't agree, and I think that's fine, because that's people. I think many times sometimes, and I think it's, many times sometimes she says, many times I think some of the challenges can be that you can have an essentialism or generalisation. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know I've said that sometimes because I'm very aware I can't speak for everyone. You're always going to have, in every community, in every area, you're always going to have different views on how something can be, right? You know, well, I don't know, you may look at, maybe a strange example, you have a museum, you have collections. There's all kinds of questions and conversation now about things that should be returned and what should not be. You can go to you could have one contingent from that community, from that culture, come in, say their view, yes, we want it returned. You could then invite another contingent and say, no, we want you to have it. Actually, that's not representative of who we are anymore. That has, you know, really negative connotations, and actually we don't want it, and we don't want that returned back to us. You can have, you know, there's actually lots of different ways that people can see something. And so this idea of having an essentialist notion, you know, that everyone would agree on that, you know, and that you can be representative of entire people. I'm not trying to do that in this context. That's why, as much as I can, I try and understand and consult a range of different voices, but I try to represent them in my work, because one of the key things I'm not trying to do is that I am not a voice. I can be like a conduit in the sense that I can represent that. I like to think as much as I can, but I am not specifically trying to say that I speak and are a representative of a whole nation state of people, which is why one of the things I try to do with having workshops and inviting people in is to recognise and show that fact. And also, there's a limit to my knowledge and understanding, so I always end up learning more, because the things that people come out with, you cannot imagine. It's just like, wow, I've never heard of that. Never heard that happen anywhere. That's a fascinating history. Oh, really? You know, and so I find them to be great spaces for people to share, and they learn from each other. So I like the debate, and, you know, it may be ways that I can actually bring those into the work. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's different, you know, you have in nature, you have predator and prey and many things. You know, you have this constant kind of like arms race of creatures and predation and different things within the ecosystem. I think it's the same way, you know, you constantly have this kind of movement and back and forth with each other. And I think those things, you know, where you can have them, I think that's great. Because in the workshop, yes, for me personally, my objective is how can this feed into the artwork I need to make for you, right? But ideally, what I'm thinking about, what's the objective for the audience, as in like the participants, for the workshop, is like, right, as much as I can, I try to bring in an area of reciprocity. So for example, you know, I'm sharing what I'm doing so you can learn what I'm doing because you're also sharing with me. So I like to think there's a level of equity or equality there. Then the other part of it is as well, 9 times out of 10, always try and make sure people get to take their work and what they make with them. So, because, you know, when you keep it all for them, I'm not going to lie, I think a lot of the time it annoys participants, you know, because they want to keep what they've made. And I think you should, because it's your momentum of that day and of that engagement with these people. And, you know, maybe the case that you're not going to meet these people again. But in that time, for those 3 hours, you actually got to meet some really interesting people and hear about them. In the best circumstance, it's not the last thing. Maybe they'll come to another event or something. So I think it's actually key that that's authentic. It's not for me to reach a consensus. It will be for me to facilitate in terms of it's a safe, trusting space that you feel that you can talk, that you feel that whatever you share is protected, and that everyone acts, you know, accordingly in a humane way. Does that make sense? So yeah.
Okay, I think, yeah. Any other questions, or we can have?
Does that make sense? Does that? Yeah. Okay.
So.
If you come to the workshop, I'm really interested in what you have to say. You're ready to go, aren't you?
So thank you, Christina. And we're going to have some, for those of us in church, we're going to have some refreshments so we can still continue to chat after that. But thank you so much for coming. And thank you everybody here. And I hope it's been very
I'd like to thank all of you too for coming as well. But also I think the courage in doing something like this, you know, there's a lot of these histories all over the country. But I think doing it as a congregation, I think takes a lot of courage, and I really appreciate it. You know, and I'm trying to do my best. Well, I will do my best as much as I can.
Thank you, Christina. That's great.